Right, we're still waiting for a few people to arrive. What we're planning on doing while that's happening, so that we don't disrupt the live stream, is we're going to show a short film that's been made as for part of the launch. So maybe if we can get that rolling now, and then we'll begin the actual session. Okay.
This Netpol report, In Our Millions, really brings together all kinds of knowledge and understanding about how policing of Palestine protests has happened. And if you were in the streets or in front of factories or in the banks or in the high streets or lobbying your MP to stop this genocide, you should read this report, because you'll see something of your own experience and understand what the police did to try and stop us. I think people understand that we're living through a cataclysmic moment in history. This is not the first genocide, and sadly it probably won't be the last, but it is one which has been constantly documented by those who are victims of this genocidal violence. And it's happened as part of the long project of ethnic cleansing and apartheid undertaken by the Israeli state. Now, the global agitation around that has given rise to a scale and variety and consistency of protests that I don't think, well, we haven't seen it in my lifetime, and probably we haven't really seen it in the West since the 1960s. On the one hand, it's a set of historical events that people rightly all around the world feel absolutely part of. You know, not apart from it. It's not just on our screens, it feels like it's part of us. For many of our friends, colleagues, comrades, it is part of them. Every Palestinian I know has family connections somewhere, either in Gaza or the West Bank, who's been facing this violence. And alongside that, there's this enormous resurgence of protest activity, and that's really heartening. But of course, alongside that, we've seen a real renewal of state repression of protest in big and small ways, sometimes in truly bizarre ways. And this report is a way of trying to capture this moment, partly so that we as a movement can remember what this changeover moment was like. One thing that is scary and notable about this phase of policing of protests is how overt political interference in the policing has been. That we've had this constant stream of political representatives and media pundits really egging the police on, saying, what are you doing? Why are you allowing these people to protest? This isn't allowed. And that has very clearly shaped the police response. The police have done things and filmed themselves as if to answer that constant political and media lobbying for them to be harder on protesters. That's one thing that I think we need to learn from and understand how it happened. There's also been an escalation of forms of policing that we know all too well. British police are always racist. They're racist in a slightly different, particular way around the issue of Palestine. In the evidence we've collected, there's all kinds of different actors saying it's pretty clear that there's racial profiling going on, very much around the young, very much around those seen as Muslim, those seen as Arab, those seen as Palestinian even though they don't name Palestinianness. And that some of that is about policing just symbols of Palestinian identity, that picking people up for face covering, but most of all if they're wearing a keffiyeh, all kinds of attempts to stop people saying particular slogans without a clear basis of why that would be unlawful. British police are not unaccustomed to disrupting or stopping protest, but there have been some quite odd events happened around this set of protests. Certainly we've seen inconsistency amongst police forces who are doing the same, policing the same protest, contradictory statements, quite a lot of odd behaviour around how the police officers try and corral the crowd into different spaces. Various witnesses talked about how on one side people from the police force were saying, oh, you can't pass, you're kettled. And on the other, people are saying, oh, you have to disperse immediately. People are trying to disperse, but then it's other police officers preventing them from dispersing. There's a kind of element of ad hocness and confusion about a lot of the policing. That was seen most of all in the attempt to say that these are hate marches. The police were clearly very unclear about what their instructions were there. We've seen people arrested for putting up a sticker or having a placard. Sometimes a placard, not even with writing on it, just with a picture. It's not at all clear that the police have any consensus amongst themselves of why they're making those arrests or how they might be justified, or even in whose interest they are. One testimony told a quite detailed story from a person who'd been attending a number of protests with a quite carefully made, handmade placard that outlined some key moments of ethnic cleansing and genocide by the Third Reich and some key moments of ethnic cleansing and genocide by the Israeli state. And in order to summarise that, they'd put a date, what had happened, and then for Third Reich crimes, a swastika, and then for Israeli war crimes, an Israeli flag. When they first attended a protest in October with this placard, they had a conversation with a police officer. The person explained that this is a kind of summary of 20th century and early 21st century ethnic cleansing. And the police officer said, oh yeah, that all sounds fine. Then they took it to some other protests and went and had another conversation with some other police officers who then asked what it's about and said, oh yeah, that seems fine. Another group of officers came and said, oh look, this is offensive. You can't have this. And the police officers say, oh, well, what's offensive is that you've got swastikas on it. But if you rub out the swastikas, then it will be all right. So they lend the person a pen to rub out the swastikas. But the pen they've got is not good enough to make the swastikas invisible. And so they arrest this person. But when they release their police press release, they say, oh, we have clamped down on the use of Nazi symbols. So there's a strong implication there that this was a Nazi sympathiser. Another famous case, what did make the media, so people probably know it, a slightly older activist in Wales who had been consistently lobbying their MP. Every week when they'd done a Palestine solidarity stall, they'd pinned with drawing pins on the MP's surgery door and the numbers of how many Palestinians had been killed then, to show a running toll. That person's house was raided in the early morning on an allegation of criminal damage on the basis of putting drawing pins in that door. And the police officers ran around the house saying, what we're looking for as evidence is drawing pins. Now this kind of thing can only be understood as outright intimidation designed to stop people from protesting. We're also hearing accounts of very excessive numbers of police at quite small protests and protests outside London, very overt surveillance of protesters, quite kind of bullying forms of taking protesters' photos, getting up in people's faces, including legal observers' faces, with cameras by the police. Arrests that seem designed to scare people, like picking up very, very young people, children, families, people in pushchairs. And all of this seems designed to make us all too afraid to keep on protesting against a genocide taking place in front of our eyes. I think it isn't working. I think we've seen week in, week out, people coming out on the streets, in their neighbourhoods, in big cities, lobbying MPs, calling for divestment, calling for sanctions. We're seeing students camping out on their campuses. We're seeing old people sitting in Barclays. It's not working. It's becoming a very heightened kind of conflict between a state which says There are no terms on which we would accept these protests as legitimate and your right to undertake. And a mass public who are saying, how can we sit still when this kind of carnage is going on? There's no sign of energy receding from this solidarity movement. I think in many ways we're just beginning. What has been revealed about the extreme violence of the Israeli state and how that extreme violence is linked to imperial violence all across the world, including police violence in the United States and in this country, that can't be packed away again easily. People understand now that their freedom is intrinsically tied up with the freedom of Palestinians. And you can't stop that. You can't make people forget that or unlearn it. I think that the political class in Britain and in the United States truly believed for a long time this would just blow over. You can hear Keir Starmer thinking, oh, doesn't matter what I say now, I'll still be Prime Minister, people forget. You can see Biden kind of carrying on as if everything's business as usual. You can even hear a kind of liberal Zionist commentary kind of acting like, oh, this has been a bit bad, but it's just Netanyahu. But I don't think that's how the world feels. People in this country and across America and Europe have seen how deeply their own state machineries are tied to the interests of Israel and the interests of empire everywhere. And as part of those interests, don't give two peas about any of us. Don't care about the welfare of young people or children or old people, or whether there's housing or health, as long as there's some kind of big military machine owning the world. But it also can't be put back because of the global south. Sometimes in Britain we can forget that the rest of the world can see. But the rest of the world can see, and it can see what the West has been doing. It's seen what they've done in the United Nations, it's seen what they've done in the ICJ, and that slowly in other parts of the world, people are acting like Britain and America and those old imperial centres are just irrelevant. That people want to remake a world with a free Palestine and a free everyone. And some of the people who think they're kings of the castle right now might find that their time is running out.
Hello everyone, to everyone who's here in person in London and all those who are watching on the live stream. Welcome to the launch of In Our Millions, Netpol's new report on the policing of protests since October 2023 against Israeli genocide of the Palestinian people. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to very briefly talk about why it is that Netpol decided that producing this report was something that we felt was necessary and important. Like many of the previous reports that we've produced on the policing of Extinction Rebellion protests, Black Lives Matter demonstrations in 2020, the protests against the G20 climate conference in Glasgow, Netpol has aimed to amplify the voices of the movements that we work with and try to make sure that the stories of the people that were part of those movements are not marginalised and forgotten. And because part of the reason why that's so important is because also often the version of our kind of collective history is one that's written by people who are deeply antagonistic towards our movements, and that's why it's important that we are shaping those, the gathering and publication of those stories. And that applies just not only, obviously, to justice for the Palestinian people, but also all the other injustices that people are fighting, whether it's climate justice or whether it's racial justice and the other campaigns that have been mobilising. The other thing that I think is equally important in this is that the stories that we gather also show the way in which the police and the state have continued to view rights to freedom of assembly as essentially a nuisance to be cracked down on. In some ways, what's interesting about this report is that there are things that are in it that are reflected in all the stories we gathered, for instance, from the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020. Amongst those are issues like institutionalized racism, the targeting of vulnerable protesters, the misuse of police powers, deliberate misinformation given to the media, and unwarranted surveillance. And as we'll go on to see, all of those issues, it's been necessary to address all those issues in our report. The thing that's significantly different about these particular protests, though, is that over the last 6 months, we've seen the way that legal protections against hate crime, supposedly intended to safeguard racialized communities under attack, have been turned, in particular, against Palestinians in this country, but also British Muslims and critics of Israel within Britain's Jewish communities. They've been turned against the kind of what's seen as the accepted narrative. What this has done is created an oppressive climate in which every act of Palestinian solidarity faces an unfair and unreasonable level of scrutiny. Indeed, is forced to constantly justify its right to even speak at all, in a way that I think is best summed up as being profoundly racist. And in preparing this report, Netpol has not been immune from many of those pressures and the enormous pressure that comes with that level of unreasonable scrutiny. We have, over the last week, had to examine every phrase, every sentence, every nuance in every comment to make sure that we, not to convince those people who will inevitably denounce this report anyway, but rather to make sure that there is no opportunities for the police, for the media, and for others to find a reason to immediately dismiss and discredit the evidence that we've gathered. In the same way that, unfortunately, the basic demands for a ceasefire and the end to Britain's complicity in genocide have been constantly dismissed and discredited over the last 6 months. The reason I mention this is, I've been an anti-racist campaigner now for over 30 years, and I can't remember anything as bad as this, possibly other than the absolute height of the war on terror 20 years ago. And sadly, that is the reality that we now face. And speaking as somebody who was one of the campaigners who was involved in supporting Stephen Lawrence's parents during the public inquiry back in 1998, an inquiry that led to the strengthening of hate crime legislation, I have to say that one of the lessons that I've drawn is that we all, from the experiences that we've had, is that it's a reminder we should be careful what we ask of the state in case one day they turn it back against us. So, anyway, sorry for that slightly depressing introduction. What I'm going to do is, the order of events today is I'm going to introduce Professor Gargi Bhattacharyya, who's the author of our report, and then the members of our panel, who are on my right, Huda Amari from Palestine Action, and we have Siosha and Amadeep from Workers for Free Palestine. Huda is an activist and writer of Palestinian and Iraqi heritage, and one of the co-founders of the direct action network, Palestine Action, which was launched in July of 2020, I think. Amadeep is a writer, organizer, and youth worker, the co-editor of Red Pepper magazine, and who organizes with Lesbians and Gay Support the Migrants, South London Bartenders Network, and obviously Workers for Free Palestine, amongst other groups. SEORSHA has developed safety strategies for protest and direct action for the Black Lives Matter movement in the US and the Palestinian Solidarity movement in Britain. They are a community organiser focusing on building joy and political resistance in the East and Southeast Asian community, and organised with several groups including the Free Palestine Coalition and Workers for Free Palestine and ESEA Sisters. And Gargi, who I introduced last, is an old friend. We've known each other probably since the mid-90s and the Free Satpal Ram campaign. He's a campaigner, trade unionist, and a professor at the Decolonising Arts Institute at the University of the Arts London, author of a number of books, including Rethinking Racial Capitalism, and a collaborator on a number of others, including one I have to recommend, which is Empire's Endgame, Racism, the British State, which includes a number of very, very cool contributors, including one who wrote our report on the Black Lives Matter protests. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Gargi to speak first, to kind of kick us off, introduce some of the report, and then I've given the other panel members some questions, and I'm just going to open up to get some answers to those. And then I'm hoping that we'll have plenty of time for questions or contributions from the floor. So, Gargi, over to you.
Okay, thanks so much. Is this close enough? Thank you for coming. I should apologise because I'm finding it very hard to speak on panels at all now, and I think I'm going to have a moratorium on speaking in public ever again. But as people understand, and you've also just heard me speak for 13 minutes, but it's kind of like, as Kevin said, it's there's a core imperative for us as a movement and across movements to document what the state does in response to our attempts to seek justice, and this has been a very important phase to do that, and I really applaud the work that Netpol has always done, but especially has done in this time when we've seen a different level, range, consistency, number of protest actions in the face of a genocide that it seems that, as Aaron Bushnell says, that the ruling class has decided that will be normal. And that kind of level of activity amongst us, amongst those people who want to save lives and seek justice, of course, so predictably has led to some different kinds of tactics from the state. So I'll just say a few things of some of the things we found, and hopefully some of what we'll talk about will be about what we can learn from that. And of course, as people understand, even since the report was written, many other new incursions by the state have happened, even this week, even yesterday and the day before. So we're kind of in a iterative process about what we can know about what they're doing and why they're doing it. Some of this has already been covered. It's very clear from October that the UK state and the media class were portraying all protests in solidarity with Palestine within the framework of hate speech, hate crime, very much echoing the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, looking out for ways of demonizing any criticism of the Israeli state. And you can see that in how people report what it's like to be on all kinds of protests. A kind of strange, well, for me, strange. I'd not seen this before. You know, the police were scrutinizing things we're carrying, including images. You know, I think that's new, and I think it's interesting to think about what that means. It puts a different kind of arbitrary power in the hands of the police. If it's up to the police, just kind of look at a picture you have and say it may be this kind of arrestable offence. But it also changed how policing happened. I'm sure people have spoken to people. Because of the huge numbers of people protesting in different ways, in quite heartening ways, there are people out on the streets and also doing kind of direct action work who might not have had much of a protest background before. So their interaction with the police force is a quite new thing. And they're being policed as if they're fascists, basically. You know, that police kind of, you're all anti-Semites and I've come to get you. So that's one thing I think to think about, and what kind of message that gives to people, and also how that filtered out beyond protest sites. And I'm sure people in the room have got experiences of this into workplaces, into schools, into other kinds of location. We also saw a lot of confusion on the part of the police force. We said a little bit of it in the film, that there are different attempts to contain the numbers of people, especially on very large protests. But I don't think we say this explicitly, but it seems clear that they were bussing in police forces from different parts of the country into London to do some of the big protests, policing. And there's not clear coordination even within the teams policing or across the different parts. Quite a lot of use of kettles in an unexpected way. My own personal view from my experiences, some of those police officers had never done a kettle before, certainly didn't know why they were doing it. I certainly was at one place where, having had the senior officer say, you all need to leave through this, I heard the junior officer say, oh, ma'am, are we meant to hold the people here? They didn't know what they were doing, and so people were being held in a place, then siphoned through a place, and stopped from going. And there were certainly arrests made, or attempted arrests through some of those things. Alongside that, there was a lot of swooping in at the moment at which a protest is supposed to end. Sometimes that was a particular time. I think sometimes it was just when it became dusk. And we heard all kinds of things about how, in particular, young people were targeted in those times, in large and small protests. You know, I think there's a question about what it is to disperse, and at what point you're not allowed to be in the street as a young person, and why you should understand that I'm not allowed to be in the streets of my hometown because I'm allegedly meant to be dispersing now. And as Kevin has already said, a lot of that targeting followed very predictable racial profiling kinds of techniques. We know that black and brown young people were targeted very much around supposed Muslimness. We know not everyone is Muslim. I don't have to explain to you that how the British police force read Muslimness. They largely read it as a physical characteristic that looks like race, which is not even a real characteristic. But also linked to that, all kinds of policing of expressions of Palestinianness. A lot of people were being asked to uncover their faces, even though those provisions were not in place in uneven ways, including young people who were saying, well, you know, there's a pandemic going on, and police saying, not anymore. But an extra rage if the face covering is a keffiyeh. Sometimes just a targeting of people wearing keffiyehs, a targeting of particular kinds of key slogans of the Palestinian liberation movement. People will have heard that there's been an ongoing tussle about whether we're allowed to say from the river to the sea. I think the answer in London, yes, we are, but we don't like it. They don't like it. But from that also, people being picked up just for having writing in Arabic, even when they're translating the writing in Arabic, cops saying, but we don't have one of our own interpreters here. At least some arrests were on that basis. Stop saying that. I wanted to say two more things. We know the British police have always targeted young people when there's big protest movements, but this is the first time in my political lifetime when I've heard a large number of stories saying that they're not only targeting teenagers and youths, they're targeting very young children. We had some stories of police photographers filming babies in pushchairs. We've had physical assaults of junior school children by police officers. I don't feel like I'm one of life's innocents, but I was surprised and shocked by that. And I think people will know that this is a protest movement where children are very, very involved. Whatever Sunak and Starmer and Biden say, children know that this is a killing spree on children, and they're absolutely engaged. And the policing of children in the UK around this, I think, is shocking and to be noted. And again, as I've said, goes from the protest location to schools and other locations children are in. And the last thing I did want to say, I didn't make the cut, but I want to say it so not everything I say is very miserable. But I also think our side has been learning on the hoof. I think the kind of consistency of protest has meant that, again, as an individual, I have witnessed all kinds of almost spontaneous ways in which people help people not be arrested, or actively de-arrest, or check in when it's a very, very young person, or stop the van. These are not all people who've come to a training. They're people who are learning together that this is what the state is doing, and to stand against genocide is also to stand against this state violence. And I think we should take some heart from that, but also think about how we can share those tips.
Thank you, Gargi. And I think that last point is really important. You mentioned that things are still ongoing and that there were protests this week where the same kind of contradictory and frankly incomprehensible policing was taking place. Just one example, a number of people were kettled on a bridge and then arrested for blocking the bridge under the new powers of disrupting key national infrastructure that were introduced under the Public Order Act 2023, which is just nonsense. But that call, I think the other element of that, there were 40 arrests, and that call for the need for us to be much better at supporting each other is also reflected in the huge amounts of work that Green and Black Cross had to put in to try and organise arrestee support for those people, and that we need to get better at planning that in advance so that we make sure that support is ready in case somebody is arrested. So what I'm going to do now is I've given 3 questions in advance to our panellists. I'm going to ask them to respond to each of them in turn. You don't have to answer at any great length, it's entirely up to you. And then if you have any, it doesn't have to be questions, but it can be contributions, and really focus on people's experiences over the last 6 months, if that is something that you can share. But first, so the first question I pose is this one. What is your key memory of the policing of Palestine solidarity demonstrations since last October that stands out for you the most? And I will start with Amardeep.
Yeah, I'm going to be annoying. I mean, that personal question is a question just in the sense that there have been so many instances of policing that has been violent, more violent maybe than might be expected in comparable situations in other historical moments. I've actually found it quite hard to isolate a memory, and I think for me that speaks to one of the most important dynamics that has emerged in regards to the policing of the Palestine solidarity movement, which is that the strength of our organizing and the violence of its suppression has changed even the most peaceful kind of A to B march into a potential site of violence, which obviously has always been the case wherever there are police anywhere. But what that has catalyzed is a kind of really clear shift among people who I know who aren't activists or wouldn't describe themselves as organizers, really the kind of catalyzing of abolitionist thought, of abolitionist language, of knowing that the police aren't and can never be on our side, precisely because they have seen and experienced the violence from the police, when even on its own liberal terms, like, is contravening what people are told the police they're to do. And yeah, I mean, there's been quite a few examples that have kind of like stuck out in my brain, though I guess one of them, and they're not always the most violent outwardly necessarily, one of them was an occupation of the British Museum by energy embargo for Palestine, which had the cops called to it, where the cops came into the British Museum. It's a very small, peaceful, temporary occupation, really heavy on the surveillance, on the intimidation, grabbing my wrist, trying to take the megaphone, that kind of behavior, that kind of peaceful occupations like you might not necessarily expect to happen previously. Similarly, at the end of an action that Workers for a Free Palestine took, the police tried to force Uber drivers to give over the addresses that they were transporting people and supplies to, and then tailed the Ubers. And on the 6th of January in particular, which is kind of like the one that stuck in my brain the most, when a rally was held by the Free Palestine Coalition at St. James's Park, the police very quickly moved in to forcibly take the sound system, made a number of arrests that were very violent, like really hurt people, like several of us got like chucked onto the road, got hit, got kicked. And then as we advanced towards Westminster Bridge, kettled a section of the march, and in doing so blocked off the bridge in any case and just held it, kind of almost heightened the tension. And it really felt in that moment like the police were trying to play a game of that they could best us. There was no tactical advantage to what they were doing there. And of course, eventually they just had to stop kettling us because they were between two blocks. But more than any of that, though, is the militarism and the resistance that Gargi was talking about sticks out to me, though, right? So, like, when I think about instances of policing, what I think about much more is the much more canny way that people are responding to it, and the militancy that's deriving from that, the way that people really are engaging in trying to de-arrest quite quickly, that when de-arrest doesn't happen, people are surrounding vans and sitting down. That kind of behavior is happening in a way that isn't necessarily coordinated by one specific activist or organizer or group. Like, we've reached a stage where the movement and the crowd is able to respond in that kind of way. And I think that's what I want to hold on to, is that despite the level of violence and surveillance, actually the level of like kind of street tactics and militancy is growing in a way that feels really, really beautiful.
Thank you. I actually want to go to Saoirse next, because this is sort of fits in with some of your particular experience. So, I mean, do you have any particular moment, or is it the same thing? Is there so many?
Yeah, it's quite similar, I think, to Amar's experience, and I think for all of us. But certainly, all the things from the report really resonate in terms of the over-targeting of children, and the kind of misapplication of like force depending on where the event is happening. So, like, for example, a protest in Brixton is going to be policed very differently than the big central marches, although obviously that is now changing. And I think from like a Workers for Free Palestine perspective, obviously a lot of our actions happen outside of London. We go to specific arms factories. They're usually in a small town, and usually we see like a local police response to that. And usually the local police response is very muted. It's very, they don't particularly care that we're there. They know that we're there for a day and then we'll leave. They also know that by now they know that we don't go into the factories, and we don't cause any material disruption in that physical way. But then we did do an action outside of the Department of Business and Trade, essentially a blockade of that building. Obviously, that one was in central London, and we were met with the Met Police. Luckily, our mobilization was very strong, so we had really good numbers in the front of the building. It was completely blocked off. But we know that police like to control your movements, right? We know that they like to feel like they're in control of that. We know it doesn't make sense most of the time that they're doing this. And then, so the Department of Business and Trade, there was a back entrance, which of course they opened up as we were blockading the front. And because that was the back entrance, there was no media there. There was not a full blockade with 500 people there. The police response was very fast and very violent. They made 3 extremely violent arrests in the pretty much as soon as the group got there. And again, in terms of our response, right, it was very organic. It was very free flowing. People moved to de-arrest. People, hardened up the picket as a response. So I think, we're clearly in a very fluid moment in time. And yeah, I agree. Luckily, we're seeing people respond appropriately. But yeah, I think it's quite interesting. Obviously, as Workers for Palestine, we're modeled after a trade union movement. I think attendees at our pickets and our actions is very varied. We're not a clearly, racialized group. We're not a clearly like Muslim-led group. So I think that contributes a lot to the police response that we see for our actions.
So Huda, Palestine Action is not a group that just blocks factories. It goes considerably further than that. So what would be the moment that stands out for you since last October?
Yeah, so I think following on from what you said, Kevin, because we've been taking direct action since 2020, we've had a lot of experience with the police and a lot of criminalisation, to the point where it's hard to realise which step up is the most outrageous, because you almost become normalised to it, which I think is very scary, actually, when you become normalised to the state's intimidation tactics. But since October 7th, there's a number of things. It's hard to say one, but I will, for the purpose of this question, try and focus on one incident, and then I'll move on to others. But recently, actually, after we had a conversation with Netpol about what's been going on, there was a raid at someone's house in Bristol, and there was about 10 police vans turned up. The whole street was full of police all of a sudden, and it was armed police. We've seen armed police before. They've come out to our actions, but we've never had a raid where they've got guns in their hands. So that, I think, was an extreme step up from what we've seen before. And what's so ridiculous about it is, in the end, they confiscate some paint, a vehicle, and, everyone's phones and everything else. But this is what we're talking about here. We're talking about paint. We're talking about potential actions against an Israeli weapons factory. And we're in the middle of a genocide, and yet they're ready to bring out, the armed police in order to stop some people, from having paint in their house before an alleged action was going to take place. So I think that was something which was quite stark. But in general, I think it shows just how the level of investigations into things has dramatically increased. And you can see that things which were normally, you wouldn't expect a certain level of response, suddenly the response is much higher. You can tell that the resources that are going into investigations from the police has increased significantly. And they don't spare any prisoners. When they raided that house, there were 2 press-accredited journalists in there. They were arrested as well, have their cameras taken, and within the movement, the people within it are very resilient, especially when we see what's happening in Gaza, and when we see, the genocide that is unfolding there and the level of violence that they are facing. But it just reminds you, it's a constant reminder of which side this state is on, and the level of violence they are willing to take in order to protect the interests of Israel over the interests of ordinary people, like the people in Palestine Action, who want to take direct action to stop these weapons factories from arming a genocide.
Thank you. I'm going to abuse my position as chair just a little bit and give my one. And it's partly because of some stuff that's happening this weekend. But my memory is of Armistice Day, 11th of November last year, which you all know what happened with the far-right groups egged on by Suella Braverman going on a rampage. But what really sticks in my mind is the press conference that was given before that by Deputy Assistant Commissioner Lawrence Taylor, who said, I'm not really worried about any of these groups. The trouble is going to come from the Palestinian protesters. And absolutely doubled down on that throughout the day until the moment, of course, when that was no longer true. And the reason why that is a memory that sticks in my head is because there is another far-right mobilisation on Saturday taking place in central London, which will be anti-fascists will be mobilising against. We will see whether the police are still so casually uninterested in the far right, or whether they will once again focus their policing on Palestine solidarity demonstrators. Gargi, do you want to add anything at all? Or okay, so I will. I'll move on then. Second question I posed was, what is the most serious concern you have, amongst the many things that we've heard today, obviously, the most serious concern that you have about the policing of these demonstrations? And I will, Huda, if I can come back to you.
Yeah, so
Because I think you may have answered the armed police at somebody's house is probably it, but
yeah, well, actually, I'm not sure at this point. I mean, right after October 7th, so obviously when you take direct action, you get used to certain charges that you'll be expecting, you understand what the trial process is going to be, you go into things knowing what to expect. But right after October 7th, suddenly the counter-terrorism laws, that was a whole new kettle of fish, and it came out of nowhere. And no one really understood it either. I mean, the first couple of months, it was just, you know, people commenting on what happened on October 7th. Palestinians from Palestine come over here. They're being baited by the press who are asking them, you know, do they support armed resistance? What do they think of this? They're being entrapped, basically, into talking about armed resistance and not realizing that, you know, just saying 3 words, which I won't say because they'll probably arrest me for it, can get you done for serious counter-terrorism laws in this country. And it's terrifying. That, I think, was one of the most terrifying things is the, you know, freedom of speech or lack of it. And when it comes to Palestine, people are used to not having freedom of speech. You know, we've gone through the whole being smeared as being anti-Semitic if you criticize Israel. But this was different because not only now can they dox you and say you're anti-Semitic and contact your workplace and try and smear your name, now they can tag counter-terrorism police and they can get the counter-terrorism police, you know, I'm talking about Zionist trolls basically on the internet, get counter-terrorism police, you know, banging down people's front doors, raiding their houses, taking their laptops, taking their equipment, for maybe a throwaway comment on Twitter or something that they've said at a speech. And, you know, and also the bail conditions that we're seeing being put on people. One of the first incidents, I think, was it was a young Palestinian woman in Brighton, you know, and they put her all over the media. She gets kicked out of university. I think she's going to face a trial coming up. And, you know, there's been more examples, very close friends of mine who have, you know, had similar experiences. And the bail conditions they've been putting on, things like you're not allowed to, for some people, not all, you're not allowed to have a phone, your own phone. You have to use a police phone so they can track you all the time. That's in addition to having to sign on regularly, you know, 3 times a week, you have to go to a police station. And yeah, and in addition to that, I think on the freedom of speech aspect of things, some close Palestinian friends of mine who said from the river to the sea, this was during a Palestine action, but they weren't actually on the action, they just came afterwards, as often happens, and came to support the action at the front. And they were chanting from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, and they were arrested for, I can't remember what the offence was, a racially aggravated hate crime, something. And, you know, they're clearly saying, you know, I'm Palestinian, they're chanting. These are chants that just a few days before they would have said in a demo, nothing would have happened. But suddenly now they're being arrested for it. No one knows the rules. Just a week before, 2 weeks before, I think it came out, there was a big article saying you are allowed to say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, but they were arrested nonetheless. One of them is on a student visa. One of them is a British citizen, and they end up with bail conditions that include not being allowed to meet up in groups bigger than 3 people. So you can't ever meet up with more than 2 people. So even as a friendship group, you can't meet with more than 2 people at a time. I mean, there's just insane conditions for a slogan, you know. And eventually, we made some noise in the press, and about 2 months later, their conditions get dropped, but you know, all during that whole time, there's a genocide going on in Gaza. They have family being impacted directly, and they can't go out and protest. They have to stay home. They can't even organize. They can't speak publicly. They're being effectively silenced. And I think there has been a huge silencing effect because of this whole, you know, arresting people for these types of offences. And so I think that's one of the most concerning things I've seen. And I think that's when you realize that, you know, maybe we are in a police state or we're heading towards that way. I can't tell the difference anymore. When you can't, you don't know what you're allowed to say or not and what can be the repercussions. And I'm actually, you know, being in Palestine Action, you expect to get arrested. You know, you expect these things. But I think when you can just say a sentence and say a slogan and face serious repercussions, then that's what really I think is concerning. And we've had people charged now with racially aggravated criminal damage in one scenario, the same scenario where the Palestinians got arrested for hate speech because they threw some paint on a bank which invests in Israel's largest weapons company, and they decided to do them for racially aggravated criminal damage instead. So, I'm sure and I hope that they will win it in court and they'll win it in trial, but it just shows what they're trying to do in order to scare people off at a pivotal time. But, it does backfire. It does backfire. They came out, my friends didn't stop protesting. As soon as their bail conditions were off, they were back out protesting. People aren't going to stop when there's a genocide going on, especially. And so I think, one of the flip sides of repression is more resistance, and I think that's what we're also seeing happening.
That issue about bail conditions is a real. I mean, the people that were arrested, I'm not sure people know this, the people that were arrested this week have been given bail conditions preventing them from attending any demonstration for 3 months, which is, it's an absolutely fundamental denial of their right to freedom of expression and assembly. There's examples that are buried in the report, and you do need to go into some of the details, but one of them is about, one of the pieces of information we were given was about how some people were given bail conditions, and then the police then turned up at their house on the day of a demonstration to make sure that they hadn't gone on the demo. Now, in probably the best part of 20 years of doing this stuff, I've never heard about that ever happening. Right? That level of enforcement of bail conditions, and it is a reflection of something new. Let me ask Silsha next. So what is the most serious concern that you have about the policing of these demonstrations? Yeah,
I think for me, it's as the state gets more desperate, right? As it's obviously not fading. The global movement is growing, and as we get closer and closer to materially impacting the state operation, so basically as we escalate, they will escalate as well. My day job requires me to understand AI and kind of how that technology is developing. So my main concern is the use of surveillance, both in the UK and just globally. And we know the blue and white state uses a lot of AI tools for their genocide and destruction. So I think it's additional surveillance, the insane levels of surveillance that we're seeing, and then that being used to do the very personalized targeting that Huda's talking about, that we've all seen from our friends and from other organizers, and even just to, obviously it has real implications for organizers, right? The way that they're tracking your movements, and the way that with these bail conditions, with the serious disruption prevention orders, the amount of people they have to surveil is really, really scary, right? Like they say, yes, it's only going to be specific organizers that we want to make sure that, they're not doing X, Y, Z, but to facilitate that enforcement, right? The amount of people they have to actually surveil is huge to that. And then I think also they're using that surveillance for just more and more intimidation as well. At the Department of Business and Trade Action, there was an attendee, so not one of our organizers, there was an attendee who was approached by a police officer who was, those were at the back, so when things were kicking off. A police officer approached him randomly, told him his full government name, told him about his movements for the last 3 months, told him the breed of dog that he pet at his friend's house, the specific squat that he'd been staying in, and the fact that he'd been going to and from, his friends' houses on a bicycle. So this is the level of intimidation, and these are the resources, the amount of resources that they have to spend on things like that. In addition to surveillance in the UK as well, because we know that the UK and the US collaborate on intelligence, on surveillance. This also really affects our movements to and from the US as well. We know that the US border control, they have a lot of remit to essentially, do whatever they want, ask you whatever they want. They can ask you to, show your phone, right, all your information basically at the point of entry. And again, right, having access to that information, or having the sophisticated tools to be able to kind of build these pictures of surveillance is really terrifying. And we also know that the most sophisticated data extraction tools that are used are based in Israel. So for me, the kind of global surveillance level is going to be really restrictive to how we can move and protest effectively.
I mean, I'm really glad that you mentioned the issue around surveillance, because it has been something that Netpol has been banging on about to the movements that we work with, often with quite limited success for the last 10 years. Partly because, of course, as well as all the increased technology, is that so much of the information that is gathered by the police is stuff that we give away ourselves. It's sharing things on social media that are not meant to be shared on social media, because not everything needs to be, right? And the idea that there may need to be some proper thinking about the levels of risk to yourself and to others within a group is something that we have given a lot of time for. We're actually going to be launching a series of resources on this in June, which is aimed specifically at getting people to think about this, because, why would people know this stuff? If you're new to a movement, why are you going to know exactly the kind of, not just the big stuff like facial recognition, but the simple stuff about what a police liaison officer is, or how much information is gathered? So, sorry, I've abused my position as chair again. Amardeep, do you want to answer that question? Your most serious concern.
Yeah, I mean, obviously agree with what's been said really, really strongly. I think some things that I'm really aware of is that one thing that we're seeing, I think in particular in universities outside of London, where encampments have been escalating to occupations of university buildings, has been police responses there becoming much more violent. There was an instance of that in, I think, Newcastle, maybe even last night. I think it was at the weekend. There was some violence in Manchester at an occupation that the students bravely put on, where police used batons. And so I think, maybe because that hasn't been the strategy of the Met so much, we're not quite as attentive to the way that the much more militarized or violent way of dealing with encampments, and in particular encampments as they escalate to occupations, is maybe something that we're not always quite as attentive to, and we're starting to see it happen, in particularly up north. I think another thing that I'm really thinking about is both the interrelation between surveillance and border violence, and how on the one hand, Palestinians and organizers and activists and attendees who don't have citizenship are being targeted, are having that are having their conditions of remaining in the UK kind of being weaponized against them in the way that the border has always done so. But at the same time, I think there's also, specifically in London, which is, I guess, what I know much more, the way that the political license for this kind of violence that the police have received off the back of far-right pressures and Zionist pressures, and a government and opposition party that are all too happy to kind of bow before law and order. I think we've seen in London in particular a kind of escalation just across the board, and this isn't just affecting demonstrations or actions around Palestine, partly because if you go to an anti-fascist mobilization, if you've been to one of the last 7 months, if you've been to an anti-raids mobilization in the last 7 months, it's very evident that people are there ballied up with keffiyehs, right? And the way that targeting is happening is also scary. There was a demonstration outside of a trans conversion therapy conference in London earlier this year, where the police pepper sprayed us, which felt like quite a massive escalation. 5 of us got pepper sprayed, would not recommend. And then additionally, with the huge criminalization of anti-border organizing that's happened over the last month with the Bibi Stockholm removals, I was at in Peckham a couple of weeks ago, and it's obviously very obvious to the police, those of us who are there who are also active in Palestine solidarity organizing, we're being surveilled to that extent that I don't think all of the arrests that happened were just purely random. Like, I'm sure that there's some kind of knowledge of who are the organizers at the kind of the key intersection of like anti-border violence, anti-fascism, and anti-Zionist violence, which is obviously both of those two, right? So witnessing how that license that's been generated by the political response to the genocide in Gaza has meant that on all of these fronts we're seeing mass criminalization and mass violence. So like a lot of the bail conditions for the recent attempted resistances of forced removals to the Bibi Stockholm prison ship, a lot of those bail conditions, you know, were like banning people from specific boroughs, like bans on specific forms of organizing. But it's also an escalation in the sense that like there was a time when like, you know, a massive community action to prevent someone being taken away in a van was something that might not quite so easily lead to mass arrests. And yet in Peckham, that's what happened. 44 people arrested. Similarly, at other actions, and there have been several over the last 3 weeks, that criminalization and that really clear violence has been ramped up. And the police are also kind of learning what seems to work better, right? Like, there was a raid in Whitechapel last week when normally the police would move in to try to forcibly disperse or forcibly remove us. The TSG didn't do that. They walked up, they put gloves on, and they said, "We are about to arrest you." And then they started making arrests. And it was only because we chose to disperse at that moment because there were too few of us. That's very much the plan. The plan is to arrest as many of us as possible. And I think we need to be attentive to the potential shift there, where police violence is obviously much more spectacular when you feel it on your body, the bruises, all of that. Actually, it feels like on the ground, some of the tactics are shifting a little bit towards, well, actually, we can just mass arrest you without even doing the violence in the first place. Well, that's obviously what cops enjoy. So I think, yeah, the concern for me is the escalation of violence and criminalization across the board, because they recognize that many people who are active around Palestine are also active across the several linked violences rooted in white supremacy across Babylon.
I mean, that one of the key, to go back to the issue of surveillance, one of the key things that the police are looking for is not just information about your movement, but also about your alliances, you know, what else you're involved in, because they're looking at trying to understand how movements will grow. And that's, again, the reason why we need to be conscious of the fact that as an activist who is actively involved in campaigning around the genocide in Palestine, you're also putting your head above the parapet for any other type of activism, particularly at the moment. So I'm going to ask the last question, which I...
Sorry, can I just say something on that
Sure.
question? Sorry, it's partly been covered already, and you covered it, that it seems pretty clear that one of the tactics that's being taken is to say that anything that any of us do against the genocide can be reframed as a racially aggravated offence. And as Kevin has already said, it feels a bit silly for our generation, as some of us pushed for such a reframing, and it has different consequences, I think, for any public order offence or any offence to be framed as racially aggravated, then has repercussions for people's immigration status and for their employment status. The police don't have to do that work, but it's pretty bad to be deported, actually bad even to get the sack. And I just feel like, I need to be cognizant of that. And once you're arrested for a racially aggravated offence, within the workplace, you often have very little comeback because it's straight black and white gross misconduct case. And the cops know that. So I feel like I just can't, and that's alongside the doxing that people are saying and the use of our own social media to identify people. I just feel, that really chills a movement.
So the final question I want to answer is this, and I realise actually looking at it again that it probably needs to be slightly reframed, because it was, what is the one important change that you want to see in the future? I don't mean what is the one reform that you want to see in the future, because there is a reason why our report doesn't talk about a bunch of reforms, because there's no point in asking for things from the state that you're not going to get. But it's not all been gloom and doom. There are examples for things that people have talked about which are positive. So in the very broadest sense, and Gargi, I'm going to ask you to go first on this one. What is the one important change that you want to see in the future as something that is learned from the experience of the last 6 months?
An important change for us or for them?
It can be for us or for them or for... You can just answer the question in whatever way you want, really.
I mean, I think a number of us have already spoken about this. It's not comfortable, but I think the kind of face-off that a very, very varied mass movement against genocide is facing in terms of state violence is drawing the battle lines much more clearly. And I'd like us to be able to say to each other more explicitly how we build and mobilise around that and equip each other, all different, you know, from the very old to the very young, to the very spiky, to the very sedentary, all of us, about how we use our understanding of policing and state violence to be agile in our protest techniques and find more and different ways, as we do every day, of taking care of each other.
Huda, do you want to have a crack at answering this seemingly impossible question?
Yeah, no, I think one of the key things is, this kind of follows on from the last answer I gave. I forgot to add this part, so I'll do that bit first. But I think one of the key things is that when it comes to the counter-terrorism stuff, something that I think a lot of us have noticed is that it's very political, in the sense that whichever cases get the most attention in the media are the ones where people get arrested and raided and possibly charged for them. And I think one of the key things which ties to that is that a lot of people who wouldn't necessarily be afraid to speak up on other issues, have been silent on their own oppression when it comes to these types of laws being used, because they're worried that if they agitate it more in the media, with positive media, then the barrage of right-wing and negative media will come as well, and it'll be more likely they'll be convicted. So it's a very difficult field to navigate, and I think it requires a lot more cross-solidarity across the movement when it comes to this stuff. And, you know, there have been instances when I've seen relatively influential people policing other people in the movement, and you're almost... It feels like setting up people to fail or to be arrested for these types of laws. And rather than policing each other's words and how exactly precise we are when we give public speeches, and if people get things wrong, showing solidarity and standing up against the state and standing up against these counter-terrorism laws, and not playing into the politicization of these arrests and amplifying it across the media. And I think on that general tone, there has been a lot of solidarity seen. And I think for the first couple of months after October 7th, no one really knew what to do or say around the terrorism laws. And I think that's changing a lot now. So I think one of the key things is solidarity amongst different movements. Even if you wouldn't personally say something, you can still show solidarity with that person and be against them facing the state's wrath, basically. And also not to allow the state to isolate parts of the movement. We've seen this with the extremism, and Rishi Sunak's very dramatic speech outside his house in 10 Downing Street, where he said, you know, get rid of the Islamists and the extremists. And then, you know, Palestine Action has been told that we are an extreme group, and other groups as well. And I think they're clearly trying, the state are trying to say there are good protesters and bad protesters. And we should not play into that at all, or allow that to become a thing. Because even when it comes to good protesters, they don't even like that, right? So there is no good protesters in their eyes. But to allow them to divide us will be a fatal mistake. And also understanding that those who may be pushed more to the edge are maybe the ones who are taking on a lot of risk, who are shutting down the weapons factories, who are taking on a lot of personal risk and getting a lot of results, and not allowing them to isolate any part of the movement. We have to stand together. And when they realize that they can't do that is when you get closer to victory for all of the groups.
Saoirse, do you want to have a crack at that question?
Yeah, definitely. I really want to echo what Huda said as well about we have to resist the temptation to self-police, right? I mean, you know, as the laws evolve, which they always will, as the police response gets more violent, it can be really tempting to essentially restrict our own right to protest by being on the defensive, in the sense of saying, okay, well, we shouldn't use those placards, or then, okay, well, we shouldn't use this language, or we should tell people who come to our actions not to do X, Y, Z. I think we're basically doing the state's job for them, right? So let's not do that. And I think as well, there's a big gap from the report and just from our lived experience. There's a big gap between what the letter of the law is and what the police actually do and what the state actually responds to, right? So I think, obviously it's important that we track what they're doing, that we understand their tactics, that we understand ourselves, the ways that the changing laws are affecting us. But on another level, that's actually not important because the police and the state are going to be moving their own ways, right? They're going to be changing the goalpost. So actually, I think it's more important that we react to what they're actually doing versus what they're saying that they're doing, right? We know they lie to the media, they lie to us, they lie to everybody. So I think it's really important that we don't focus on, being good, being obedient, citizens of this country, and we actually, resist in a meaningful way, and we have to ourselves understand what that means, right? And as an organizer, there's nothing more, I think, bad for a movement where it's just a mass of people that are mobilized, but don't take responsibility or don't have their own understanding of why they're in this movement, right? Organizers, we can do a lot on the ground or in preparation in terms of, setting something up, preparing for the day, preparing, police station support, for example. But I think what happens on the day and how people show up, that needs to be a self-responsibility, and that needs to be taken seriously. And, as organizers, we should facilitate that and not restrict ourselves and not restrict each other's right to protest as well. So yeah, I guess the summary of that is the one change would be, for us to understand the reality that we're in and to respond to that, and for us all to take personal responsibility to do that.
Thank you. We're quite pressed for time, so Amandeep, do you want to have a crack at that last one, and then I want to try and see if we've got a little bit of time to take some questions.
Yeah, I mean, the joke's answer to that question, I guess, is abolition. That would be pretty good. I think that would sort stuff out. But the serious one, I guess, really want to echo what Huda has said about not falling into the idea of good and bad protesters, and what Siorsa has said of not falling into the trap of thinking that our relative safety or our relative differentiated criminalization or differentiated proximity to violence is a result of necessarily a particularly responsible way of organizing rather than how the state is moving. And it's really, really important to recognize that. I think a lot of that solidarity is being built. I see a lot of that recognition in the movement. I know there are people who, will contribute to the pylon and will contribute to the dynamics that lead to the criminalization of our comrades, but those people are not actually in the movement. I think we should be honest about that. The people that say shit like that, they're not in the movement, they're not doing the work, and they can chat all they want. What we focus on is the material solidarities that we are forging through the work. I think in terms of something that I guess I want to see change a little is, I think I want us to take seriously the fact that this level of state response is a reaction to the state, to the strength of our organizing. And I want us to take seriously the fact that while we are witnessing much more violence on the streets, while we're witnessing such an escalation in surveillance, we actually do have the capacity, we actually do have the skills to face that and to organize around it and to organize against it. And so I don't want it to be the case that, people hear about the way things are escalating from the state and say, okay, it's getting more spiky, I need to be more careful. Obviously, be careful, take precautions. But the fact is that actually, if we get upskilled, and there are comrades in the movement who have these skills, right? If we get upskilled, if we focus on training each other up to take autonomous action, training each other up to keep each other safe, the next time the cops try and kettle us, they're not going to fucking be able to. So I want us to take seriously the power that we do already have, right?
I'm going to offer one, sorry, but I am. And it's maybe not the most important change, but it's certainly one I just need to keep on banging on about again, which is if you go on the Know Your Rights training, that's great, and you've got some basic information. If you don't tell your friends what you've learned at that Know Your Rights session, expect them to go on a training course themselves, then you're doing a disservice to their level of risk. And you if you get this information, spread it. Make sure, if we've got the idea that we are each responsible for each other when we go out and take part in protests, and that's an individual thing as much as anything else, right? Look after your friends, and if they get arrested, make sure you're outside a police station ready to provide them with the support. Don't think that there's a big sea of anonymous volunteers out there, because it's usually a very small group of very, very stretched people that are desperately trying to do this. Because of the issues around anonymity, I was reminded that that actually getting people to talk about their own experiences might be a bit of a risk. But is there anybody who wants to ask any particular questions of anybody on the panel? Can I see any?
About their very close friends and their experiences.
I see a hand over here. If you say the question, and I'll repeat it back for the people at home.
But I want to talk about my close friends, if that's okay. Oh, of course. So one thing, and building on a lot of what all of you said, first of all, thank you for the report and the panel, of course, is this idea of isolation when you've been arrested, and the kind of advice over and over again to not go public because it wouldn't work for you if and when things go to court, right? And that does so many things, and particularly part of that is also the ridiculous bail condition of you're not allowed to go to pro-Palestine protests. But also if you're an academic, you are probably suspended from work. You can't really talk to your students, even if that's your specialization, right? Or if you're a teacher, or. But also I've noticed in the report this category of released under investigation, which is, to my understanding, not really, it's a bullshit category, which essentially means that if your devices have been taken by the police, they still keep them. And while you might be free to leave the country, for example, you are expected upon your return to the UK, and maybe other ports, I don't know, to, if asked, first of all, you'll be questioned, but also if asked about your PIN for any of your devices, you must comply. Otherwise, you'll be charged with a criminal offense. And I've seen this happen a few times, the RUI. And also part of that, it's not just the surveillance and the silencing, but it's also about your inability, while this the release under investigation category goes on forever, perhaps, is that you can't challenge police arrest, just in case. Just in case if this goes to a jury, the jury will be like, oh, actually, you're guilty, so yeah. So I'm just talking about my friend's experience. Thank you for listening.
I mean, there's a couple of just quick points. The release under investigation is slightly different to the issue about coming back into port. So release under investigation was originally a way of avoiding giving police bail, because police bail had been so heavily criticised for people being on it for long periods of time. And it actually is being phased out. But what it essentially means is the police don't have enough evidence to charge you, and they have to go looking for more of it. A lot of people do sit under that RUI's category and then end up not being charged at all. The entry into ports thing is very specifically a counter-terrorism power, Schedule 7. And it is true that if you get stopped under that power, you are ordered to provide your PIN, and if you don't provide it, that itself is a criminal offence. It's not something that happens all the time, but it's still something which is, it's very difficult for people to be able to prepare for, particularly certain people who get targeted all the time. Anybody else got their hand up, wants to ask a question or make a comment? Now I know that there is a roving mic. You can indeed make a comment. There's a hand over here.
Not sure how you can answer this or want to answer this, but in very soon to happen protests or counter-protests that are happening on Saturday maybe, do you have anything that you could share or like have thoughts on like what protesters should be prepared for in terms of policing, mainly because policing this specific week has been so strange?
Wow, that's a tough one. Because, I mean, one of the things that's come up from this is just how arbitrary so much of the policing is. It's actually really difficult to be able to predict from one protest in one place to, you know, one in a completely different county or city.
I think Saturday will be quite different as well, because we have the Zionist element, and that always makes police react even more unpredictably. So there's the combination of the police response and then the Zionist response, and then how we respond to that could potentially be quite fluid on the day. So I'm not sure if there's any particular advice. I mean, personally, I would say just be prepared. And I think be in communication with others around you so that you can react to what's happening on the ground. Try to be in a group of 3 people. That's usually quite a good solid number to look out for each other, to do formations, to be defensive or maybe offensive. But yeah, maybe I shouldn't share too much on here. So we'll chat after the session. Thanks.
I mean, obviously the presence of Tommy Three Names and certain fire art groups is also, it's impossible to know exactly what the police's response to that will be, and it may well be, given the past experience, that they decide to very strongly focus on them. It's just impossible to say. That's the problem. I think that's good advice, though, that just don't be more aware that you and stick together at this particular demonstration. So, any other comments at all? We've got about another 5 minutes, so not long. Anyone? Yes, the front here.
Yeah, people are outside.
Yeah, a very predictable question from me, so apologies. Huda, you talked quite a lot about your particular concern on the use of counter-terror powers in quashing freedom of expression and how terrifying it is. So yeah, I know you've got a small section in the report on the use of counter-terror powers. Just wanted to hear a bit more maybe, whether there's any work that you're planning on doing further on this, whether that's from Palestine Action's end or from Netpol's end, on kind of challenging the use of counter-terror powers and on challenging the use of hate crime and hate speech powers as well, legislation more broadly. Thanks.
Thank you for the question. I think on the terrorism thing, I mean, it's probably not a good approach, but I think myself and my friends who've, experienced what they can do, it's been more of a let's hope it goes away. And I don't think that was really working very well. But I do think that there is something about, we have heard of so many different people across the country who have experienced counter-terrorism arrests, who've had their stuff taken, been raided, and people don't really know how public to go, how not public to go, because it's so new. When it was mentioned before about courts and things, for myself and for others, when I've taken direct action against Elbit, I've been very public, about why I took my action. And even though my lawyer always tells me how to stop talking about it, but to be honest, I found it helped, because when I was on trial just last December, they're playing all the things I have to say about Elbit to a jury before I even have to speak. So they're hearing about it, and they're hearing about what this company does, and having to hear me talk over and over again about why I did this action. So, but this is a whole different kettle of fish, where the worry isn't so much how is the jury going to see it, it's how is the state now going to charge, what are they going to charge with? There is such a variation from glorifying terrorism to support of terrorism. I think glorifying is magistrates' court, support is a Crown Court case, and the sentencing is so varied. You just don't know how to deal with it. And so I think that there will be, and there is organisations like Cage as well, who have been supporting people through this. And so I imagine more more will come out. But it's just been, since October 7th, I think so many organisers and people who might have been experienced these types of arrests have been trying to keep organising for Gaza, and keep on going. And a lot of key organisers have been targeted by this, and so they want to keep on going because they keep seeing the genocide going on. That a lot of them haven't necessarily had time to stop and reflect on how to deal with the incoming possible terrorism charges. And I also know that, not from direct experience or from speaking to her directly, but that some of the people who have been charged and are going to court are trying to dissociate themselves and don't know how to approach this from a political level, and so are taking a more isolated route and hoping that a jury will acquit them. So it's a difficult time, and I think there needs to be more of a concerted effort put onto it on a wider level. I think in terms of the hate, the racially aggravated stuff, so when it wasn't actually, the two Palestinians wasn't necessarily part of a Palestine Action. They were supporting it, but we did support them. They were my close friends. And one of the things we did was get media attention on it. They got it in The Guardian, and actually just a few days after it's in The Guardian, then they dropped the bail conditions. But, we can't rely on The Guardian to report on every single case we have. That would be great if they did, but they won't. So there is a lot of having to try and get media attention on the most egregious parts of it from friendly journalists and being tactical about it, and just keeping strong as a movement and being prepared for the trials and fighting it in court, which really is what we're left with.
I mean, from Netpol's position, there is the crucial thing to remember, but say with the terrorism charges, is there is a difference between somebody being arrested for those and somebody being prosecuted for them. And quite often it's the threat or the possibility of being being arrested, but certainly of being charged, is the chilling effect that it has on people even protesting at all. And that's why I deliberately referenced that kind of heightened point of the so-called war on terror 20 years ago, because that's exactly what it was like then. I think with both those charges, and certainly with the racially aggravated charges, there's a difference as well between, partly because of the chaotic nature of much of the policing that Gargi talked about, of people just having to face long periods of waiting, and then the charges potentially being dropped at the last minute or being really poorly presented in court or whatever it might be. And that means a couple of things. One is to make sure you've got a good lawyer who understands this stuff, and there is a protest lawyers list that's available on Netpol's website. The other is to make sure that you have plenty of support for people who are in that position, because it's incredibly isolating. And then the final thing is to sue, right? This is an absolutely disproportionate use of police powers, and it's really important that people sue. And I guess the final one is that if an opportunity arises, there are organisations including organisations like ourselves. We don't have massive resources, but there are other human rights organisations who are looking to legally challenge the way some of these powers are being used. I know there are limited benefits sometimes in being able to do that within the confines of the law, but we still do have human rights protections. They still have some meaning, even within the awful situation that we talked about today, and we should use that. We should use that to push back against the disproportionate, arbitrary nature of the way that police powers are used. So that would be my suggestion, and also obviously just make sure you know your rights and get some good training. So,
can I ask a follow-on question? Because I think
you can.
So first, as you've said, and people have already said, it's obviously makes a very dangerous landscape if people are getting arrested for an alleged racially aggravated crime for picketing or painting a bank. Like that means all bets are off then. So on the one hand, I think that is just really dangerous for everyone, because it feels like, well, every symbol of capitalism they're now saying is protected as a protected characteristic. on the other hand, I've also actually, despite my doubts about what the law can do, feel anxious about what it does to actual racist violence and our ability to regulate or use any kind of legal challenge or regulation against that at all. So I just kind of wondered if you had any thoughts about what this period has done to, you know, the state response to real racism, or maybe just to people in the room could say.
I mean, that's a really big one. I mean, I have to say, at the time that racially aggravated offences were brought in the late 90s, I was part of a group that was one of the founders of Netpol that were opposed to the introduction of those because we felt that they would not be used at a time when racial attacks were routinely being ignored by the state.
Can I just make a quick addition to that? I think one of the most upside down things of all of it is that the racially aggravated laws are being used in a very racist way.
Yeah.
And so you're being discriminated against, you're experiencing racism, you know, and the instance I talked about, it was two Palestinians. They'd spoken the mic, they knew they were Palestinian, they'd said they were Palestinian. They were deliberately targeted for calling for their homeland to be liberated. You know, it's extreme, it's obviously racist, and then they're being told that they're racist for saying these things. I mean, you just, it's so upside down.
It's bonkers. It's absolutely bonkers.
It's insane, isn't it? It's just
But
insane.
it does go back to the point I made at the beginning, right? If you expect the state to protect you, then you've probably got some very unrealistic expectations of what the reality is.
And I think there's some like really big lessons there for like the queer movement as well in relation to, I remember the peak of people talking about hate crime legislation, and even the adoption of the language of like hate crime as crime being the operative word rather than any other language around harm. And yeah, the idea that the state can mediate that the heterosexist white supremacist state is going to mediate any kind of thing in relation to those structures that it creates through criminalization is surely out of the water by now. And I think, yeah, maybe this is too hopeful, but I think in terms of like the movement, I think one thing that the stark disparity between the language, the race relations, industrial complex language we have around what racism is and all of that kind of stuff, like the movement at least seems to be shaking it off for a more materialist analysis of race. And that feels like something that does have important political utility to us, even though it obviously is a loss in terms of like the liberal protections around like hate. Those were always fragile anyway, and like actually a more materialist understanding of how race is constructed and how the state is constructing it, even through hate crime legislation, is actually like not a small thing for us to be realizing.
Yeah, just a real life example of hate crime legislation being, well, one, ineffective, and two, actually purposely harmful. So the U.S. passed it was the COVID Hate Crime Act after a shooting incident in Atlanta where eight ESCA women were killed, and then in response to all the kind of street violence, right, that East and Southeast Asian people were facing in the U.S. So they created a Hate Crimes Act, which essentially just gives more resources to policing. Right? If you're going to frame hate crimes in a criminalized way, right, and that's a response, then all the resources go into more policing, more incarceration, and also more racist targeting, because we know that the majority of those incidents were perpetrated by white people, but the policing, right, and the kind of framing was more against black people, especially in the U.S. And again, I think hate crimes also is not the right framing, right? It's not that people hate other people. It's structural racism and structural issues that the state sanctions. So yeah, I think at best, it's ineffective, and at worst, it just increases policing and increases racialized violence that the police does.
I'm afraid we've run out of time. Can I just ask you to show some appreciation for the panel members for their contribution? For the benefit of people who are watching this on the live stream, please download a copy of the report take a look at the extensive evidence that's in there, and if you want to sign up to get further information about the next steps of what we're going to be doing, then please do that. I would also say that a recording of this session will be available on our YouTube channel in roughly about a week's time, which will also be subtitled. We did try to get signers for this evening, and it's proven to be incredibly difficult to do that. Can I just thank all of you, both online and here in London, for attending this event. We're very proud of this report, and we are really, really pleased to see so many people showing up and supporting its launch. Obviously, the next thing will be just to say we'll see you all on the streets. Thank you very much.